what ended up happening was this was received by there were about 25 nations that had been part of some discussions that this accord was being developed. But when it was presented to the plenary session with all of the nations present, it was greeted with a huge reaction, just pushback that this was, the heavy-handed U.S. just being dominating, and the accord didn't have the kinds of commitments that were necessary, and the huge reaction. Particularly the Venezuela group, led that charge, and Tuvalu also was outspoken. That Tuvalu was sort of the spokes nation for the island nations. It was actually Sudan that made the charge about the Holocaust, saying that the African nations were being given a suicide pact. Things were about to completely fall apart, and General Secretary Ban Ki-moon offered an alternative to throwing the accord out and just everybody going home, and that was for all of the parties to take note of the accord. And on that basis, it was accepted, and actually a lot of the developing countries, particularly the African nations who feel just a tremendous sense of urgency to move forward, they felt this was better than nothing at all. And so the accord was taken note of. So next slide. What that means is that what will happen now is that the countries that want to sign on to the accord, they will submit their individual greenhouse gas reduction targets. The developed countries will, and the developing countries will commit to the actions that they will undertake. Ivo de Boer, the Executive Secretary of the UN Convention, he gave a press conference just a few days ago, and it was kind of a post-mortem on Copenhagen. What's the significance? Where are we? Did it fail? And he did, his perspective, and I think it's very reasonable, is that this was the first time that climate change was raised to the highest level of governments. I mean, it wasn't the case in Montreal that you had so many heads of state there and really making this just a national priority. Secondly, there was a political consensus that was reached through the accord that provides a foundation for moving forward towards concluding the treaties, and otherwise there really would have been nothing in place. And finally, a lot of the negotiated text had actually put in place some very important provisions that are building blocks that will be important going forward, most especially on reducing deforestation and forest degradation. So that's a very important piece. Next. So I mentioned the sign up for the commitments to the accord, and so by January 31st, the countries actually have to list what their emission reduction will be if they're going to be a party to the accord. So it is voluntary. The U.S. commitment is woefully inadequate. It's going to be 17% from 2005 levels, and so when you look at that compared to 1990 levels, it's around 4%, and it's nowhere near what's needed. But one thing that we just have to keep in mind is that Obama was completely boxed in by what was happening in the U.S. Senate, because if he overcommitted, there would be no way he would have traction when he came home to try and put forward, press for legislation. So the parties will meet again in Cancun in end of November and December of this year, and it's unclear now whether they're going to be able to pull all this together. Next slide. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that the direction we were going domestically in the U.S. is the direction we need to go, but with a greater sense of urgency. We have to cap carbon at the federal level, and put in place the legislative tools to build a clean energy economy. We have to really be aggressive in our state level initiatives and find the model legislation that's going to really be a tool to spread to other states. Local initiatives, all of the building code work that is going on is very important. Sierra Club is a major contributor to the effort to stop new coal plants and sunset existing coal plants. Our national coal campaign has stopped. It's over 100 plants now, which is but we can't let up there. And finally, we need to look for new initiatives where there's a real need to make a difference. And I'll just mention two for Sierra Club. One is the India program, which is really an effort to help civil society in India build support for a sustainable alternative to fossil fuel-based economic activity. And also redirecting World Bank funding. And after Copenhagen, I was reading a very chilling description of World Bank funding by Bruce Rich, who's a leading attorney on international finance for environmental organizations. And he was describing that on the one hand, the World Bank is funding, I mean, everybody knows this, but funding renewable energy projects, but meanwhile, they are handing over millions and millions of dollars, I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars to build new coal plants in India. Last year, over $300 million for Botswana to build a new plant, a 600 megawatt plant, and they're looking at new plants in South Africa. And so we have a complete disconnect between the direction our policy needs to go and what's happening coming out of the World Bank. So that's something that Sierra Club and others will be ramping up our work on. And it does look as if there's some openness within the U.S. administration, Obama administration, to actually take this on and try and redirect World Bank funding. But it's going to be against the resistance of some of the developing countries now who are looking for that funding. Next. Okay, so I just very quickly, I think that I felt very privileged to be there, and I think that anybody that went to the conference had a different experience. I mean, my experience was different from Dick's, but the really wonderful thing was a chance to meet specific people that sort of put a face on the what is happening out there. And three for me were the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. It is a network of 102 organizations in 37 African countries. They have very little resources. A lot of them had to raise money, have their villages help raise the money to send them to Copenhagen, but they are raring to go. They are, networking, and they're looking for ways to really promote sustainable energy at home and to prod their delegations to be supportive of controlling carbon pollution. And they were just a very impressive group. And one of their members was a Nigerian activist, and he was very willing to be filmed and have his profile put up on Sierra Club's website, just taking his government to task for being in bed with oil, and it was pretty remarkable to see, given how risky that is. Second, the Tuvalu representative, Ian Fry. I encourage you to go to YouTube and just you can look up Ian Fry. He gave just a very moving address to the talks, just talking about the fact that his country is just tremendously threatened. He said, that the entire population lives below 2 meters above sea level, and there they are at the mercy of the U.S. Senate, and just the complete craziness of